despite China certainly being an authoritarian state, it is one party, there are no independent courts, there's weak rule of law. Actually, the government has shown itself to be relatively tolerant of protests. And so one of the reasons that you have potentially 180,000 incidents of protests in China each year is because governments are willing to tolerate it. And people understand that if they protest, there's the possibility that they can win their demands. So at this point, the government, although it's anxious about social stability, protest is something which has become a regularized form of political contention in China. If we look at labor protests in China, again, this is the primary source of conflict now in Chinese society. In some ways, China, the pattern in China is not at all surprising. China is not exceptional when you compare it to earlier countries at a similar stage of industrial development. There have also been high levels of conflict. And this is true if you look at places like places in East Asia, such as South Korea or Japan, and it's certainly true if you look at places in the West, such as the United States, England, France. All of these places at a similar stage of development had high levels of conflict among the industrial working class. Now, in China today, some of the primary strategies or tactics that workers use include strikes. This is the most common form of conflict. There's no such thing as a legal strike in China. So every time workers go on strike, they're doing so without legal protection. They've often used more radical tactics as well, including blockading major roads, including holding sit-ins at government offices, and sometimes more violent tactics as well. There have been incidents of rioting, of taking their bosses hostage, and even of killing bosses. Grievances for workers include non-payment of wages. I think over the past 2 decades or so has probably been the primary source of protest among workers, simply not getting paid the wages that you're owed. But low wages, even if you are being paid and you're being paid above the legal minimum, there have been an increasing share of strikes recently among workers demanding higher wages. There have been strikes against discrimination, strikes against bad food. Oftentimes, the workers in the cafeterias or workers that live on the facilities. They live there and they eat there, and the food oftentimes is not good. The dorm conditions are not good. And the majority of these strikes probably take place among workers in the manufacturing sector. Now let's turn to talking in some more detail about the major strike which took place at Yue Yuen in China in April of 2014. Yue Yuen is the world's largest shoe manufacturer. It's a Taiwanese company, and they produce shoes for many famous international brands, including Nike, Adidas, Asics, Puma, and others. In 2012, they produced approximately 300 million pairs of shoes, and they had approximately $500 million in total profit. So this is a very large company. They have production facilities in a number of places in China's Pearl River Delta, elsewhere in China, and they also have very significant production in Vietnam and in Indonesia. But the factory that they have in Dongguan in the Pearl River Delta, just north of Hong Kong, is the largest factory, and this is where the strike took place in April. So the strike which took place in Yue Yuen is, by most accounts, the largest strike that has taken place in a private employer in reform-era history. So that means since 1978, there has almost certainly not been a larger strike. It's difficult to know precisely how many workers participated in the strike at Yue Yuen, but there's more than 40,000 workers at the factory. Some estimates say that there was as many as 30,000 workers which were participating. Some say 10,000 workers. It's difficult to independently verify. Nonetheless, this was an extremely large strike. So what were the reasons for the strike at Yue Yuen? Well, the reason that it was most frequently cited is social insurance. And social insurance includes a variety of things in China, including health insurance, including maternity leave, and particularly important for these workers was the question of pensions, right, or social security, as we would refer to it in the U.S. And so this was the issue that was most prominent among workers during the strike. But in subsequent interviews, some workers revealed that actually making social insurance the primary issue was, in some senses, a Trojan horse. And they chose this issue because the legal violation of Yue Yuen was so obvious, because they had not been making the legally required social insurance payments for many years prior. And so by framing this as an issue of legality related to social insurance, then this was more likely to gain them support from other people in society and from the government, and to make it seem as if it was not particularly politically sensitive. But in fact, workers had other concerns. Most importantly, and this is not surprising, is that their wages were too low. And really, the overwhelming majority of strikes in China are about the question of wages. Workers reported making between 2,700 and 2,200 yuan a month. This is approximately $400 US per month. In order to make this much money, they had to work quite a bit of overtime, so their base wages were much lower than that. And most workers in manufacturing in China assume that they're going to have to work overtime in order to make ends meet. They had not received any raises in recent years, and so as the cost of living had increased around them, they felt that their standard of living was in fact declining. Now, another issue that they raised, which is directly related to this question of inflation, is a housing fund. And real estate in China has become incredibly expensive. Even rents have gone up quite significantly. And so as Dongguan and these places in the Pearl River Delta become more developed, workers are finding that they really can't make ends meet. So they also had demands about housing subsidies. Now, although this was a large strike, this was not the first time that there had been conflict in the Yue Yuen factory. In fact, there had been many previous small-scale strikes which had taken place at this facility. But the facility in Dongguan is quite large, with a large number of workshops and factories which feel almost as if they are separate entities. And so the previous strikes had been small in scale and had typically not extended beyond a single workplace. But in April 5th of 2014, this new strike began. And initially, it too was small and did not include workers from all of the workplaces. But the strike persisted for a variety of reasons, for longer than is typically the case for strikes in China. And in part, it was because they framed their demands as being in line with the law, that they were just demanding that the laws around social insurance be effectively implemented. On April 14th, the workers began a march, and they were going to march to the local government offices. And this created problems. The government and the police are typically okay when strikes remain inside the factory, but as soon as you leave the factory, then you're creating a social disturbance, and things can become pretty tense. Now, the police came in and they dispersed the protesters. There was incidents of police violence against the protesters, and a number of people were detained as a result of this. Once this happened, and this was widely circulated on social media, then there was a lot more, this actually added a lot more fuel to the strike, and so many more people became engaged with the strike at this point. The enterprise-level union in Yue Yuen was not useful in responding to worker demands. And this is quite common throughout China, where workers will frequently go and talk to their unions and say, we want some sort of improvements, but the unions are typically controlled either by management or the government or by both, and so are not very active respondents when this sorts of things happen. Once the strike in Yue Yuen really picked up steam in mid-April there, initially it seemed as if the unions were going to be supportive. And so the union federations, both in Dongguan City and the Guangdong Federation of Trade Unions at the provincial level, got involved. And workers were initially quite happy about this. The Provincial Union Federation issued a statement, and they said that they are, quote, taking a clear-cut stand, end quote, that worker rights must be protected. And so, again, workers were heartened by this statement. But subsequently, the position of the provincial level union changed. They issued a letter urging workers to return to work immediately, regardless of the outcomes. And eventually, there's evidence that the union was working quite closely with management and with the police to bring the strike to a close. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. Another very notable thing which developed in the course of the Yue Yuen strike is the involvement of NGOs, or civil society. Now, of course, China does not have a huge amount of space for NGOs because of the authoritarian nature of the government. Nonetheless, particularly in the Pearl River Delta, a number of labor NGOs have emerged there over the past 20 years and are able to accomplish some things. Now, this is not the first time that NGOs have been involved in strikes. NGOs in China almost never lead strikes, but frequently when a strike breaks out, they will play some sort of role in advising workers on what they ought to do. But there was more active involvement and certainly more prominent involvement of a number of NGOs, and in particular one called the Chunfeng Labor NGO in the area. There was a series of open letters which came from NGOs, including a joint letter which was signed by many NGOs in the region and from around the country. And these letters, in a situation in which the workers didn't have their own form of formal organization, sought to articulate a certain kind of position, articulate a set of demands for the workers. Additionally, it advised them on what their legal rights were, and therefore there were some implications about the kinds of demands that they might be making. Another thing that the NGOs did, which was important, is that they drew attention to the role of the brands, the Nikes, the Adidases, the Pumas, and their responsibility in paying social insurance for the workers. And this is something that workers frequently don't have much of a capacity to do because they're in China, they don't have strong connections with international communities, they don't speak English, and so the NGOs were saying, well, look, even though Yue Yuen is the immediate problem, they've not been paying your social insurance. Ultimately, these brands are responsible because they are the ones that are paying Yue Yuen. There was also involvement among students, and including some student radicals, and they were publishing different sorts of articles online. And one of the things that was very notable in this strike is that it attracted a lot of attention. There is now a sort of a more developed space on the internet for discussing various kinds of political issues, which is not to say that there's no government control of this space. But what we saw is a diversity of viewpoints which came to be expressed about the strike, and many students and intellectuals got involved and were writing essays, and this was, I think, notable because it gave workers the opportunity to begin to think about some sorts of political problems, although they were not addressing them directly in the strike. One thing that was interesting about the strike is that Yue Yuen is a Taiwanese company. Now, of course, officially, from the Chinese government's perspective, Taiwan is part of China. But Taiwanese investors, practically speaking, are treated as foreign investors within China. And we saw the development of some sort of anti-Taiwanese nationalism among the workers. And in previous strikes, This has also been the case, particularly in Japanese factories, where workers have said, look, this is not just a struggle of workers against their employer, this is a struggle of Chinese people against some exploitative foreign boss. So one poster was put up around the facilities during the course of the strike, which read, "Fellow countrymen, to protect our rights, we must fight the Taiwan Lao." Taiwan Lao is a mildly derogatory term for Taiwanese people. "We must fight the Taiwan Lao to the very end. Perseverance is victory. Defeat the Taiwan Lao. Defeat the mainland running dogs." And so there's this way of sort of framing the strike as being an issue about nationalism rather than simply economic interests. Framing strikes in sort of nationalist terms, particularly when you're in a Japanese factory, is more likely to win the allegiance or win some level of protection of local governments, because governments don't want to be seen as intervening on behalf of the Japanese, of course, who have some historical animosity with China, to defend the interest of the Japanese employers against the Chinese workers. And so we saw some of those dynamics here as well, even between mainland China and Taiwan. And the strike continued for almost 2 weeks, and this is longer than most strikes last in China. One of the reasons that it is able to extend for a longer period of time is because there was continual media coverage. And if you have media coverage, that means that the central government, in essence, is aware of what's happening and that they haven't shut it down, because that is the central government's prerogative. But the final outcome was not positive from the perspective of workers. After the strike had extended for nearly 2 weeks, a decision was made higher up to resort to repression. The employer had made some minor concessions, but concessions which the workers almost universally rejected. So rather than agreeing to pay in full all of the unpaid social insurance and to increase their wages, the employer agreed to pay an additional living subsidy of 230 yuan per month. So this is less than $40. Workers were unhappy with this. They were continuing the strike, but the government decided that they were going to resort to coercion to end the strike. Police came in. They beat up workers that were identified as leaders or people who were advocating to continue the strike. Dozens of people were detained for some period of time. One of the workers said in response to this, quote, "Now there is naked collusion between the state and capital to repress workers." Oftentimes the police, they came into the factory grounds and they physically forced workers back onto the shop floor. This didn't necessarily work. Once they forced people back onto the shop floor, they still continued to not work, and so they just held a sit-in in the factory. But eventually, this resorting to repression broke the spirit of the strikers, and the strike came to a conclusion. What were the outcomes of the strike at Yue Yuen? Well, the first thing is that it inspired a strike at a different Yue Yuen factory in Jiangxi province, several hundred miles to the north. It's important to realize here that this strike was not directly coordinated by workers, right? That this was a copycat style strike where the Yue Yuen workers in Jiangxi saw what were happening in Dongguan, and they decided, well, hey, we have similar problems, let's go on strike as well. But there was no central coordination going on here. Coming back to the main strike at Dongguan, workers saw it as a complete loss. To quote one worker, he said, "The factory almost did not yield anything at all, aside from giving us an additional 230 yuan living subsidy." And in general, workers were quite disappointed with the outcome. Now, some of the NGOs didn't think it was so bad because in addition to this 230 yuan subsidy, the company agreed that they would make their legal social insurance payments moving forward. The workers were not impressed by this because they said, well, look, it's good that the company is now going to make the social insurance payments, but the way social insurance works in China is that the employer pays some part and the employee also pays some part. So this means that in essence, their wages were going to be reduced to pay for the social insurance. And so at the end of the day, life was actually going to become more difficult for them because they were getting a wage cut. So what they really wanted was full social insurance payments to be made and wage compensation to make up for that difference. There's also a concern about how back the social insurance that had been unpaid for the previous 10 or 15 years was going to be made up. And it was unclear whether employees were going to be responsible for that. Certainly, the employers were unlikely to make up all 10 or 15 years of that. So NGOs were saying to them, this is not such a bad deal. We have this agreement to enforce the social insurance law moving forward, and they issued a letter instructing workers on what their legal rights were and how they could work with management and work with the social insurance department to make sure that these payments were made according to the law. The NGOs, though, did face some repression. Two prominent members of this Comparative Labor NGO were detained by police. The head of the NGO was only held for a few days, but the second in command was imprisoned for quite a significant period of time, and many people in China were concerned about this, as this seemed to indicate stepped-up repression against NGOs. Quite practically speaking, for the factory, one of the consequences of the strike was that orders were reduced. During the course of the strike, Nike said that they were now considering shifting production away from Yue Yuen, and Adidas said that they were going to shift some of their production to Vietnam. And this was something that many people were upset about because it seemed as if they were leaving behind their responsibility to pay the legally required social insurance. And because there was a reduction in orders, this meant that workers had less overtime. Well, that might be a good thing because then you have more free time, but it also means that their wages were down. So typically migrant workers in China are upset about losing overtime. They demand more overtime. And so with the reduction in orders that came after the strike, in essence, their wages were reduced still further. Yue Yuen announced that the strike had cost them $27 million, but that moving forward, having to make the new social insurance payments will cost them $31 million for 2014 alone. So something that'll be really interesting to see moving forward is how that increase in price for social insurance gets negotiated between Yue Yuen and the brands, which are their purchasers. Who's going to bear the cost of that moving forward? Some workers tried to see the silver lining in what was generally considered to be a loss. And there was a letter that was published by someone claiming to be a worker from Yue Yuen, and the title of the letter was "Don't Cry, Yue Yuen." And I'm going to read a short passage from it. It's true we lost. We resumed work under violent attacks from police batons and dogs. But although we've fallen down, we still feel glory because we participated in this mighty action to protect our rights. And this action will become a milestone in the history of Chinese worker rights. And they specifically went on to thank supporters that they had from around the country, support that they received from people in Hong Kong, Taiwan, as well as overseas. Other workers saw this as a loss, but were convinced that this was not the end of the fight in Yue Yuen. And this is something that we see frequently, which is that in the course of protests, the government or employers will do just enough to prevent the protests from continuing, but they oftentimes will fail to resolve some of the serious underlying grievances, thus ensuring ongoing conflict. So one worker said at the end of the strike, quote, "On the surface, the strike has been repressed, but the contradiction still exists. The problem hasn't been resolved, and workers are still furious. We are especially dissatisfied with the way the government intervened to repress workers. Everyone feels rage, especially as we have been forced to work. Yue Yuen will have another strike within a half year, and next time we will have just one demand. Raise wages by at least 30%, because a wage of 23 to 2,400 is not enough to survive on. Now I'd like to move to an analysis about what Yue Yuen means and what we can see for the consequences for protest in China. First, what is novel about this? And as I've suggested already, the scale is truly impressive. Perhaps tens of thousands of workers. This is almost unprecedented in China. The second thing which is really important is that workers' primary demand was around social insurance rather than wages. This kind of demand, it's not that it's the very first time that it's appeared in China, but there's many reasons to believe that it's going to be increasingly important.
Well, migrant workers now constitute a majority of Chinese workforce, and the kind of stay-on enterprise workers that you still find in cities, they are urban residents. So they have at least the status that bring them more welfare, more entitlements in the cities. Migrant workers actually still do not have the kind of equal treatment, entitlement as urban residents. The hukou system has not changed. This is another factor I think people should pay attention to. Despite all the talks about reforming or possible reforms about the hukou system, migrant workers still today are second-class citizens. They're treated as second-class citizens in the cities where they work. And with the changes in the countryside, where we have heard reports about rampant land grabs, these migrant workers are not thinking of returning to the countryside where they don't have lands anymore. So that is the reason why they feel so hopeless and sometimes meaningless and feeling lost about who they are and what they're going to do in the future. Because unlike the previous generations of migrant workers who would be assured of land rights at home, they know that after working in the cities for maybe 2 decades, they can go home and retire and still have a piece of land to farm. This generation of migrant workers cannot rely on a piece of land at home as the ultimate security.
The structure of Chinese migrant workforce has changed, and people are older. Because of tight labor markets, they are continuing to hire older people. And so I think that moving forward, we can expect to see more sorts of demands that are moving beyond simple wage demands to questions about social insurance, so that people, as they move through life, can feel some degree of security. The role of the outside groups is pretty interesting here. Now, the police initially displayed a characteristic that we might find surprising, but they were actually advising protesters on how to protest. And workers reported that at the outset of the strike, they came and they said, if you don't cause major disturbances, we're not going to intervene. If you stay in the factory, we're not going to intervene. And so, this is somewhat surprising, but again, an indication the extent to which protest has become something which is just a regularized part of the political process in China. That being said, of course, the police eventually did resort to repression, and that's simply because of the length of the strike. So while there is some degree of tolerance, there are limits. And one of the things which is challenging for protesters in China is the fact that all of these protests are happening outside the bounds of legality. So they are constantly in a legal and institutional gray space, which gives the state flexibility to behave exactly how it would like to behave at any given moment, which means that protesting, although it does not necessarily mean that you will end up in jail in China by any means, it does mean that it continues to be a risky way to have your grievances aired. The trade union, we didn't see any major changes in the way that the trade union responds. As I said initially, they were hopeful that the union was going to do something, but eventually things changed. And one worker said, quote, "After the union intervened, the capitalists and the police had a change of heart and they brutally repressed the workers." And more importantly, this comes back to the question about representation and organization for protesters in China. Workers remain quite suspicious about the role of the union. the same worker said, quote, now, even if the union said that they wanted to help us to hold new elections, the activists wouldn't dare to stand up. If you stick your head out, you'll get killed. Now, of course, he doesn't mean that you'll literally be killed, but he does mean that you'll face potentially certain kinds of consequences. There's a change in the role of NGOs. As I've suggested, they were more actively involved in trying to give shape and form to the protests as they evolved. But it's important to note that NGOs are not a replacement for actually representative organizations. NGOs do not have any formal process where they come to represent protesters. They intervene once the protest has happened. They may be able to speak on behalf of workers, but there's no democratic process at work there. Sometimes they've come under criticism from workers and from students from being overly legalistic and trying to contain workers simply to the legal terrain, even if those laws are not necessarily beneficial to the workers. And at the end, we saw that the NGOs saw this as a victory, whereas most workers did not. Over the last several years, there's been a lot of discussion about legal reforms in China and the movement to rule of law, even in a case in which courts are not independent from the Communist Party. But this movement to rule of law, which has resulted in lots of things, including a series of new labor legislations which are meant to help workers, has not always meant a whole lot for them. And part of the reason for this is the Chinese state is large and complex, and it has internal divergences and tensions. So if the central government passes a series of laws which are meant to assist workers, they don't necessarily get faithfully implemented when you get to the local level, because local governments typically see their interests as much more aligned with employers than they do see than is the case for workers. And of course, courts at the local level, as well as the Ministry of Human Resources and Social Security, which oftentimes adjudicates labor conflicts, are controlled by the Communist Party. And so if the local Communist Party wants laws to not be effectively enforced, then that will be the case. So there may be an expanding set of rights that workers have on paper, but if they're not actually being implemented, they don't really mean that much. Now, we can see this very clearly in the Yue Yuen case. Workers had the right to social insurance, but it had been going on for 15 years that they hadn't received any of those legally mandated social insurance payments. So the strike was, in essence, about trying to get laws implemented. And this is a generalizable point that we can see for many different kinds of social grievances in China, that there are laws on paper that are not going to be enforced unless protesters go out there and unless they make trouble. To sum up, at the moment, the Chinese government is fully able to ride out expansive but fundamentally cellularized social unrest. It does not pose any major threat to state power. The government has developed various techniques to keep these protests contained at the local level, and the Communist Party remains firmly in power. That being said, this protest is exacting real costs. Certainly there's a cost to employers in these labor conflicts, and we can see that Yue Yuen lost tens of millions of dollars as a result of this strike. If they don't have an effective mechanism for regulating labor relations, then this is going to continue to be a problem from employers' perspectives. Economically, there are costs for the state as well. Sometimes they come in and they simply buy off protesters. If you have workers that have unpaid wages, they'll go to the government offices and the government will say, okay, here's 50% of what you've owed, and we're just going to pay it to you. So at the moment, the Chinese state has got quite a lot of cash on hand, and so they can absorb these costs. The question is, how long will they be able to do that? And do they want to create the kinds of incentives where workers and other aggrieved citizens are continually coming to them to get these sorts of payouts? The political costs to the government of ongoing protest are somewhat intangible. Protesters typically claim fidelity to the Communist Party, fidelity to the central government, and they say, look, the problem is simply that the local governments are corrupt, that the local governments are not faithfully enforcing the laws, and those are the bad guys. But there's a question sort of long-term whether workers' dissatisfaction with the government will scale up. And we saw in the Yue Yuen strike that workers came away from it dissatisfied with the government's role in bringing the strike to a close. So the state continues to be unwilling to compromise on basic political issues. They're operating under the belief that more political space for protesters will engender chaos, and if there's chaos in China, then nothing else matters. The economy will suffer, and all of the citizens in China will suffer. So given that they're unwilling to change any of the basic political structures in China, we can assume that this pattern of high levels of relatively contained unrest in China will persist, at least for years to come.